This week on Personally Speaking, our guest is a former Navy SEAL and New York Times best-selling author Jack Carr. Please stay with us. Hello and welcome to Personally Speaking. I'm your host, Msgr Jim Lisante, and former Navy SEAL and New York Times #1 best-selling author Jack Carr joins me now. Jack's latest book is called Targeted Beirut. The subtitle is The 1983 Marine Barracks Bombing and the Untold Origin Story of the War on Terror, which delves into the tragic events of October 23rd, 1983, when terrorists struck the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Lebanon, resulting in the deadliest single-day loss of life since World War II. Jack's book gives not just a narrative of the events, but an examination of the context, the motives, and the aftermaths of major terrorist acts. As a former Navy SEAL, Jack has led special operations, but he's also a #1 New York Times best-selling author of 8 books, with Targeted, his groundbreaking launch into nonfiction. Jack's debut novel, The Terminal List, was adapted into the #1 Amazon Prime Video series starring Chris Pratt. Jack is here with us today to talk about his life, his career, and about the devastating events in Beirut that changed the course of history. Joining me now, I'm so pleased to welcome to Personally Speaking the best-selling author, Jack Carr. Let's talk about Targeted Beirut, because I loved it. You know, I know that most of our listeners and watchers will be very familiar with your fiction. This is your first nonfiction book. I have to tell you, and for our listeners and viewers, get hold of Targeted Beirut. I could not put it down, and I'm a slow reader, but I got through it pretty quickly. Let me ask you this, because one of the things I was struck by in the book was I think of my Israeli and Jewish friends who, ever since the Holocaust, always have that motto, never again. We're never going to lie down and play dead and take it. And so every time you attack Israel or the Jewish community, retaliation is part of the deal. You have to know that's what you're going to have to deal with. As you say in Targeted Beirut, something horrible happens to America and there's no retaliation. Now, I guess the Christian part of me is saying, we have to forgive. But I think from reading the book that you may suspect or may feel that we missed an opportunity to make a point by not being retaliatory. What do you think? Retaliation, does it make sense?
Oh, certainly. And then, forgiveness actually became the theme of my fifth book. I think it was fifth book. So each book has a theme, and there's such power in forgiveness.
Yeah.
You can get that, of course, from reading scripture. You can get that from just life lessons in general. I think it's the experience that comes over just a lifetime kind of lends itself to that notion. And so there's so much power in forgiveness. When we're thinking of it in those terms through that kind of prism, we're already at war, essentially.
Yeah.
So essentially, someone else has declared war on you. You just haven't recognized it yet. And you can go back even further to some of the lessons of the why behind these things, which we tend not to do very well in this country. You can go back to 1953 and a CIA essentially sponsored coup and the repercussions of that, and how that led to 1979 and the revolution and the Iran hostage crisis, and then how that kind of leads up to Beirut 1983. But certainly once you're in that position, by not retaliating, what we did is teach Iran that terrorism works. And not just Iran, but other countries around the world, other super empowered individuals around the world, terrorist organizations around the world. That was the takeaway from Beirut 1983, specifically October 23rd, that terrorism works. More specifically, it works by using proxies. And that is an effective way to get an end political result that you want, which is the United States out of a certain area, in this case, out of Lebanon. And that really those were the rules that were set in place, not by us, but
Yeah.
by Iran back in 1983. And essentially, we've been playing by those rules ever since, as has Israel to a lesser extent,
Hmm.
of course, with the major exceptions along the way. But they've fallen back to those rules set by Iran really in the early 80s. So there are lessons to be learned, and we're not that good at learning those lessons, like I mentioned, which is one of the reasons
Yeah.
why I wanted to write the book, because that's at least that's something I can do.
Yeah.
I can't make anyone read it. Can't policy makers, bureaucrats,
Hmm.
at Washington, elected representatives, military officers, and enlisted both. I can't make them read it or draw certain lessons from it, but it's there. It's available, and for me as an author, that's the least that I can do.
Jack Carr is our guest, and the book is, as I mentioned, targeted Beirut. You said that what we learned in the beginning in Lebanon was the experience of the plan of terror. But I have to ask you, since many, many years have passed since that attack in Beirut, what have the terrorists actually achieved? We haven't left the Middle East, and they haven't won any major victories that last. So I'm just wondering whether it's 9/11 or the experience in Beirut for the United States Marines and sailors and soldiers. They do terrible things, and it's shocking. I give you that. But long term, what's the effect in terms of any victory for them?
Long term, it set an acceptable level of violence, as horrible as that is to say, on both sides. So, a certain number of people, Americans can be killed, Israelis can be killed, a certain amount of Iranian proxy forces can be killed, and there's this kind of symbiosis, this steady state that doesn't get too far in either direction, and it becomes this long term acceptable level of violence throughout an entire region that really keeps Iran, for a lack of a better term, stable via its ruling class, essentially the same ruling class that came to power in 1979. So it's a steady state for Iran. And certainly when we're looking at Lebanon in particular, it hasn't helped the Lebanese people at all. That stability for Iran, but that's really what it has resulted in. And there was an acceptable level of violence even with the United States and Iraq, right next door to Iran. Obviously, Iraq and Iran having fought a war in the 80s that had people don't even know the exact numbers, but it hovers around 1 million people dead. That ended essentially in a stalemate. But there was an acceptable level of violence there as well. They could funnel IEDs across the border, more specifically the EFPs, the explosively formed penetrators that defeated our armor in Iraq. We knew exactly where they were coming from. We knew exactly where the orders were coming from. We knew the rat lines because they don't just smuggle, they're centuries old rat lines that have smuggled things not just across borders because borders were more of a fluid thing in that part of the world, but it makes sense to us. So I'll use the term borders back and forth for centuries, not just for weapons, but for people, for drugs, for any sort of contraband,
Hmm.
back and forth for centuries. We knew where these rat lines were, and for some reason, we don't hold Iran accountable, even though Americans are dying for the entire time that I was serving in Iraq. Those EFBs certainly led to the deaths of friends of mine. But once again, it goes back to what we were talking about earlier with that acceptable level of violence. We don't hold Iran accountable. And so they've pushed it up. They know what those limits are, and they take it right up to the line, a little bit over every now and again, but then come right back. And that's what it has resulted in is stability essentially for Iran, where they know that we or Israel won't go after certain
Hmm.
things like ports, like energy infrastructure, perhaps even nuclear capabilities. But that's what it's resulted in, and no one else in the region benefits but Iran.
Jack Carr is not only a best-selling author, but he has mentioned his service in Iraq, and he also served in Afghanistan. Jack, that a lot of people, especially in America, will look at the military enterprise in Iraq and Afghanistan and compare it unfavorably to the experience of Vietnam, of kind of a quagmire that, in the end, produced very, very little. Having served in as a Navy SEAL in both Iraq and Afghanistan, was it worth our efforts?
It's such a tough one because when you're talking and you're thinking about the audience and you're thinking about parents who lost children, you're thinking about brothers and sisters who lost siblings, you're thinking about wives and husbands, people who lost spouses. Um, yeah, it's a tough one to answer because you have to take into account what they're living with. day in and day out. But you also have to you have to be honest and take those lessons and apply them going forward, hopefully as wisdom. Once again, we're so poor at doing that in this
Yes.
country. Um,
Yeah.
so what I go back to is that that's what we owe those who died there, is to take those lessons, to be honest about those lessons learned in Iraq and Afghanistan, the reasons for being there, the reasons for staying as long as we did, the end state, the goals, the shifting priorities. Was
Mhm.
it all worth it? I think it's not that simple of a question, because if you're going to ask a simple question like that, then a simple answer would be no,
Mhm.
with the benefit of hindsight. But that's why the question, I think, needs to be a little more nuanced, and the answer needs to be a little more nuanced in that: what can we draw from that experience? How can we
Uh-huh.
prevent these things from happening again to other families, so that other parents don't lose children, so that other brothers and sisters don't lose siblings, so that other people don't lose their spouse? So that's really what we owe those people who went downrange. And that's the real failure, is if we do not do that going. That's how we fail the people who didn't come home, and those who came home forever altered, whether that's physically or emotionally. People will be dealing with the physical and psychological trauma of the battlefield for the
Mhm.
rest of their lives, not just them, but their families. So these decisions made at strategic levels have multi-generational impacts. Just like the decision to put Marines ashore in Lebanon back in 1983. It's a very similar lesson, in that people back in air-conditioned offices in the Beltway are making strategic level decisions that have very real tactical level consequences, not just for those Marines, and in this case also sailors, also soldiers who were
Mhm.
put into Beirut in 1983 and 1982, leading into 83. They came out in early 1984. So not just for them, but for their families. Those multi-generational impacts that I talked about are very real. And so those people making these decisions up here, the
Mhm.
final decision maker in a decision that is made in the Oval Office, it filters all the way down to an 18, 19, 20-year-old kid
Yeah.
with a rifle, off safe, finger on a trigger, standing at checkpoint somewhere around the world, even today, watching a car approach this checkpoint, wondering if it has bad suspension or if it's laden with explosives,
Yeah.
and having just seconds to decide what they're going to do. And that is the last decision maker in a chain of decision makers that starts with the president of the United States. It was true in Beirut in 1983. It was true throughout our time in Iraq and Afghanistan, and it remains true today.
One of the reasons Jack Carr, I wanted us our guest, is because in reading Targeted Beirut, I was struck by the fact that so many young people today have no memory at all, or recollection, or interest in knowing about how our Marines died, and the soldiers, and the naval folks. But I mention that because I've had people in my parish who don't even remember 9/11, kids who grew up after it. And so the book, I think, serves a great purpose in giving people an opportunity to know our history. And so, as you say, to form a nuanced idea about what we do in the future, learning from the past. One of the things your book did for me, Jack, was that you gave me a new perspective on a lot of people. I'm a big fan of Ronald Reagan, and you made me both appreciate his regret in sending in the Marines and what happened in Lebanon, but also the decision itself, and sometimes the foolishness of decisions like that. But you also gave me a new perspective. One of the most popular people in popular mind, anyway, are people like George Shultz, the great Secretary of State, and yet he's the person pushing for the Marines to go in and to stay. And then Caspar Weinberger, who doesn't usually get good press, you give to good press. In the same way, Barry Goldwater, who probably lost in 1964 because he was viewed as this warmonger, you paint as the man who says, hey, there's no reason for these guys to be over there. They shouldn't be there. Were you surprised by the fact that as you studied these popular individuals, you got to see, again, a nuanced and different side of them?
I was. My vision of a lot of these same people that you mentioned was that of kind of the popular recollection, the popular accounting, I would say. And in this, I really wanted to make sure this wasn't a book of, let's say, popular history, pop history,
Mm-hmm.
meaning it wasn't going to be me reading a bunch of books on the Middle East, on Beirut, on terrorist organizations, kind of regurgitating that and then giving my analysis. I wanted this to be a real work of history, which is why I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
work with a historian, Pulitzer Prize finalist James Scott, amazing guy, someone who knew how to do this research correctly, dive into these archives, go to the Reagan Library, dig through all these files, go to the Marine Corps archives, dig through those, do all these interviews, properly annotate it all, and create a real work of history. So in doing that, it means you have to be honest about everything that you find along the way as you
Mhm.
tell this story. And so for me, that those were surprising. But the Reagan was my president growing up.
Yeah.
That was I mean, I knew about Jimmy Carter a little bit, have a vague recollection of the 1979 hostage crisis. That's one of my first
Hmm.
memories. So Jimmy Carter was kind of the first one I have a memory of, but then Reagan was my president through my most
Right.
formative
Right.
years. And then so to learn about how he ran these different meetings and the people that he surrounded himself with and how he didn't like that conflict, that was surprising to me. And a situation like this, and I'm sure others, could have benefited from more debate, more robust debate
Hmm.
with him involved. And he didn't like that. And I realized that a lot of it is probably because he was an actor. And as an actor, you're on stage and you want that audience to like you. You want them to love you and love your performance and connect with you. And I think that really carried over into a lot of the other things that he did throughout his life, is really wanting that audience, no matter how large or small, to like him.
Hmm.
And so I don't think that in this case really was beneficial. So that was surprising to me. But then I got to talk to Michael Reagan, his son, and he told me that what happened in Beirut in 1983 haunted his father till the day he died.
Jack Carr is our guest. Targeted Beirut is the book we're talking about. Let's talk about the man behind this great book that I hope our listeners and watchers will get and truly read. The family of origin for you, Jack. What did your parents do right in raising you?
Reading,
Ah.
and really not setting limits. And if they set limits, meaning about what I could achieve, it wasn't that they set them intentionally. It was more subliminal in that almost like, do you know how hard it is to do something? It was something that I just caught onto, that I still catch onto today in conversation. So meaning they didn't do it on purpose, but what they did was open a whole world to me through books and reading. My mom was a librarian. I was surrounded by books and a love of reading from my earliest days. I remember going to pick out a book every night, and they'd alternate days. My dad would read one night, my mom would read the next night. I got to pick out that book, and then eventually I started reading those books. And then I moved into the young adult fiction, like the Farley Mowats and the My Sides of the Mountain and those sorts of books like that, like Hardy Boys, like those sorts of things. And then about fifth grade, I started making that transition to the same type of books that my parents were reading that were on their shelves. And I always looked up at those shelves growing up, and I'd see these covers and I'd see these names like Robert Ludlum and Jean Le
Mm.
Carre and Ian Fleming and Ken Follett. And I'd think, oh, one day I'm going to read those books. And so I started doing that in about fifth grade. And then certainly by sixth grade, I was reading those same kind of books that my parents were reading. And now I'm reading David Morrell and Nelson DeMille and A.J. Quinnell and J.C. Pollock and Mark Olden and Louis L'Amour and Tom Clancy and all these guys who were essentially my professors in the art of storytelling. And that's certainly from sixth grade onward. And I'm reading all these books from the fan perspective. And I'm reading a lot of these books because the protagonists in them had backgrounds that I wanted in real life one day. So I knew I wanted to be a Navy SEAL since I was 7 years old. Found out what SEALs were very early on. I knew I wanted to join the military even before I was age 7, but found out what SEALs were at age 7. My mom took me to the library. We did some research on SEALs. I found out that you could find the end of the internet back then. You could read everything written about SEALs, special operations, most of it focused on Vietnam, and then there was nothing left, and you'd have to wait for something else, another article maybe perhaps in the mid 80s to come out on Navy SEALs or special operations or Army Special Forces or something. So the protagonists in these books, by the authors I just mentioned, typically they had backgrounds in Vietnam as a Army Special Forces soldier, Navy SEAL, a Marine sniper, CIA paramilitary. And now they were contemporary thrillers, let's say written in 1984, 85, 86, 87, 88. But because of the skills that they had from operating in Vietnam, they had the tools to solve the problems in the pages of these novels. And so I was reading them because I thought, oh, a guy like Tom Clancy, a guy like David Morrell, who created Rambo with First Blood back in 1972, they must have done their research. So I'm learning something about special operations, about the military, about tradecraft when you're reading things by Jean Le Carre or David Morrell, who took the best of essentially UK crime spy fiction, Jean Le Carre, and the best of at the time US spy fiction with Robert Ludlum, and he combined those two with Brotherhood of the Rose, moved the genre forward. So I'm reading all these things from the fan perspective back then, but also because I'm interested in the protagonists and what path these guys took in Vietnam. And then a lot of times they went into the CIA. And now in the mid 80s, they were a private investigator or they were a stuntman or whatever they're doing in these books that allows them to be a part of this story and move the plots forward. It really comes back to reading. So it's the nonfiction, it's the fiction, and reading those things, I think, during a time when I wasn't going back, essentially. Let's say I didn't wake up at age 40 and say, if I wanted to be an author today, or I want to write a book now, what should I have been reading for the last 30 years?
Mm-hmm.
I've already been doing all that from the fan perspective. So I knew what I liked, knew what I didn't like, knew the structure, but not because I was looking at it academically, and nor did I have anything else to do back then other than to essentially read and stay out of the way. There's no car payments, there's no mortgage, there's no family, kids to get to soccer practice, a job to go to. That's a big one. So there are all these responsibilities aren't there yet, and neither are all these distractions with phones and apps and social media and just constant bombardment from social media companies and all the rest of it that has invaded our lives over the past couple decades. It was different. You had this freedom to take a breath and dive into these pages and enjoy them for the magic in. I would say the biggest gift that my parents gave me were books and reading, and really the freedom
Mm-hmm.
that came through that reading. Because through that reading, I was also very aware of history. And so when I'm on the beach in Coronado, California, doing push-ups during Hell Week in Buds, which is where we get most of our attrition in SEAL training, I'm thinking, you know what? I'm not storming a beach at Normandy, running into a hail of machine gun of bullets from an elevated position. I'm not. This isn't Iwo Jima. I'm on a beach in Southern California, and I'm here because of the sacrifice of all these people
Mm-hmm.
who gave me this opportunity to follow my dream, which is be here, testing myself in SEAL training to see if I have what it takes to make it. I can do a few more push-ups. I can stay cold a little while longer. This is really nothing in relative terms
Yeah.
because I was aware of that history. So this, I think, the foundation provided by books and reading has really led to all else.
And that comes from your parents. Jack Carr, for our listeners and watchers, is not just a former Navy SEAL and a great author, but he's also someone who has three wonderful kids. And as he says, I have three wonderful kids, a dog, and a wife. And I always ask the couples before they get married, like, why did you know this was the one person that was right for you? Can you share in any way, shape, or form? How did you know this wife of
Yeah,
yours was the right one?
I just knew. First time I saw her when I was 18 years
Really?
old. Yeah. And I don't know, I don't really analyze why too much. I just, it's kind of that gut instinct, kind of like same thing that has kept us alive over millennia is this gut instinct, this sixth sense. And it's usually right.
Mm,
So I just knew, and I didn't analyze it too much. I didn't really ask the whys. I just kind of knew. But us being together, if people listening to this know anything about the military or special operations in general, that the divorce rates are very high. Uh,
mm,
and then we also have a middle child with really severe special needs, and also around special needs families, those divorce
yeah.
rates are very high. So this is all a tribute to my wife for being so strong.
Wow.
Uh,
Yeah,
and also understanding that when you're in the SEAL teams, that pendulum has to be on the side of the team. I think probably, and this is, of course, I don't like to guess at things very often, but I will in this case, that some people are surprised that when they get married, that spouse has a responsibility to the people that he and her, in these days, she is going down
mhm.
range with. And that means that the pendulum has to be on the side of the team because you're going to be making decisions under fire, downrange. They're going to have consequences to that person to your right and your left, not just for them, but for their families. And if you're going to take that responsibility on as a leader and as an operator, that's where the pendulum has to be. So your spouse has to be very understanding about that and realize that
Yeah,
the is going to be on the side of the team for as long as you're taking people down range, because that's a responsibility that you have accepted. And then maybe eventually it'll come back to the family when you leave, but or you don't have those responsibilities anymore. You maybe go to a staff job or something along those lines. But if you're taking people into battle, then that pendulum 100% has to be on the side
right.
of team, and your spouse has to understand that and be okay with that. So that's something that we would talk about. You can't assume it as the person who's taking these guys down range. If it might seem obvious to you, it might not be so obvious to your spouse. So I think it's something that important that you have to verbalize, talk about, and not just once, but time and time again throughout your journey in special operations, or whatever it
Mhm.
is that where you have people's lives in your hands. So all of this is a great testament to my wife and her strength.
We had the romantic novelist Nicholas Sparks on. I said, "What's the secret of finding the right marriage?" And he said two words: choose wisely. And it looks like
Yes.
she did, and it looks like you did too. Final question, I promise. Jack Carr's our guest. Targeted Beirut is the book we've been talking about. Um, you know, and I know that not just in our country where we're like 50-50 and we're red and blue, but also around the world, there is such division. And going back to Frank Capra, the wonderful film director's movie, It's a Wonderful Life, he says discouragement is the greatest illness. And I wonder about discouragement when we look around and we see the division. Is Jack Carr in this crazy, mixed up, sometimes divided world? Are you still a person of hope?
I try to be, and it's the same question that I ask people on my podcast very frequently, because I'm curious as well. Because when my wife and I sit down at the end of the day on the couch, get the kids to bed, maybe have a glass of wine, and just talk through the day or the week ahead or the year ahead or the kind of the state of the union, I guess. It's tough. It's tough to remain hopeful because a lot of people are profiting from this division. And I
Yeah.
think the first thing that it takes to remain hopeful is to realize that it's intentional. That this division is intentional and it's not to your benefit. It's to the benefit of the social media companies, to the political parties, to different companies that are trying to get you to take a certain action. It's a manipulation of thoughts and behavior. And we're carrying around a device that allows them to do that in our pockets every day. So I think the first step, like in many things, is that awareness, and then you can take steps to mitigate some of those manipulations, because that's in fact what they are.
Jack Carr's been our guest. You know, Jack, last year my mom passed away at 102. She
Oh
had
wow.
waited 4 years for my father to come back from the Pacific Theater. But I mentioned that because I said to her at one point when she was 102, you know, Mom, you just had your fourth great grandson. Isn't that wonderful? And she said, Oh, four boys. And she paused and she said, Oh, God, please, no more wars, no more wars. Because in her mind, you always sent the boys out. Now we send the boys and the girls. But Jack, I think a book like Targeted Beirut makes us so painfully aware of what any military activity means in terms of people, real families. One of the things this book did, and it's why you made me cry throughout reading this book, is so often we hear the numbers, oh, 240 some odd Marines died, sailors died, Army people died. But you give us a face and an identity and a sense of the individual and the impact on their families like no one I've ever seen, which is why I want our listeners and viewers to pick up Targeted Beirut. And I thank you so much for writing it. Thank you for all your writing. It's all great, but this one touched me in a particular way, and I'm so grateful for your witness to the truth by the way you write and testify. Jack Carr, thank you for being with us on Personally Speaking.
Thank you so much for having me. Take care.
Thanks for being with us on Personally Speaking. If you need to reach me for any reason, you can do that at personallyspeakingpodcast@gmail.com. You probably listened to this program on the Catholic channel, 129. And you can do more than that. You can watch it as well on YouTube if you like by searching under Personally Speaking with Msgr Jim Lisante. I'm delighted to serve as host and executive producer, Personally Speaking. Our producer is Lisa Jandovitz. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll be with you again next time on Personally Speaking.